Hey guys, it's Don. I'm glad to see you're checking in with me. I just want to take you back a few years. In my case, really about 70 years. I want to go back to when I was just a kid. I mean, a young kid, 6, 7 years old. Really back when me and my brothers used to run around together. Used to do a lot of fishing, a lot of hunting. Uh, back back in, well, I guess maybe mid 60s. Uh, we used to make a trip every year up to Rice Lake, Canada. And, the other day I was just sitting back in my lazy boy and just closed my eyes. I was a little tired and I started thinking about what it was like back when I was first getting into fishing, when I was first just old enough to really understand the concept of fishing. And I'm guessing, I don't know, I was probably 6, 7, 8. I don't even remember. Um, and I remember back in those days, my younger brother Bill he used to follow me everywhere. He used to tag along with me all the time. I didn't run around a lot with my older brother. He was kind of a loner, and a lot of times when we went to Rice Lake, which we did every year, he'd kind of be with my dad. He was the oldest, and he'd go out with my dad. They'd fish together, and me and my younger brother would fish together. And that, of course, that was a little bit later when we were a little older. But even back then, we used to get a when we rented a cabin. Back in those days, we'd go up, and they had different fish camps all around the lake. And this was Rice Lake, Canada. We lived in Ohio at the time, northeastern Ohio, so it was about an eight hour drive. And boy, I remember it well. My dad always had a station wagon. He always thought that was the most practical car, and he wasn't much for fancy glitz and glamour. He was more of a practical, hands-on kind of guy, and he loved station wagons. And we used to pack that thing to the hilt. There were four kids in the family, and we'd take everything you could imagine, pots and pans, and you know, clothes for because we'd go up there for 2 weeks. It wasn't a short trip. My dad worked for BF Goodrich, who was a tire builder, and so, they shut down every year around the 4th of July, which kind of tied in and coincided with the uh, start of bass fishing season up on in Canada and on Rice Lake. And so the timing was really good. So we'd go up there every year. We'd pack up that station wagon. I always took the far back end of the station wagon, and I'd take all the pillows back there with me. And I hated, I had no patience at all when I was growing up. Now that I've gotten older, I've got a little bit of patience, but not a lot. But back then, I had no patience. And, if I knew we were going to do something, I wanted to do it right now. I didn't want to have to wait. And, the trip up there was 8 hours, and that's, with reasonable traffic. If we happened to get into some bad weather or some heavy traffic, it'd take even longer. And that was just, that was just ridiculously too long for me. So what I would do is I'd get all the pillows, I'd put them in the back of the station wagon, and I'd make myself a little bed back there. And I'd immediately, before the car was even started, before my dad even pulled out of the driveway, I'd be asleep. And my goal was to sleep all the way until we got there. And then I'd wake up and we were there. And so it was an easy solution to my problem of not having any patience. And when I say there, what I really mean is we weren't at the lake yet. We were at a little depot or a little store, not too far from the lake. And we always stopped there and we picked up milk and a few other things, mostly food items. But me and my brother, we just, man, we were so excited because that's what we were looking for. We couldn't wait to go to this little store. And the reason was we saved up. We didn't get much of allowance back in those days. And we'd get a silver dollar from my grandpa every year for our birthday. But besides that, I mean, I don't even remember if we got an allowance. But But we'd save our lunch money. We'd skip lunch and, you know, play basketball or something during the whole lunch period, not eat anything, and save our quarter or whatever we were getting for lunch. And it added up. And by the time we went to Canada, we'd have a couple of bucks on us, and we get up there and they sold firecrackers. And I got to tell you, when you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, anywhere in that age, maybe even later, 12, 14, firecrackers are just a lot of fun. And we would buy as many as we could. And we had to be careful because, my dad didn't like firecrackers. He never did. Yeah, he said they were dangerous. We'd blow off our fingers. And of course, we ignored all the warnings from him and from other adults. But we always wanted to get we normally we'd get lady fingers. That was the main thing that we bought, and we bought a lot of them. The little ones, and they're only an inch and a half, 2 inches long. There'd be a pack, maybe 50 in a pack. Sometimes you'd light the whole pack and they'd all go off. Other times you'd throw them out one at a time. They weren't real powerful, but they were fun. And sometimes we'd buy things a little bigger. Uh, our favorite was cherry bombs. For those of you who can remember cherry bombs, we uh, we used to have a lot of fun with those. But we'd load up on them. We'd get them up there, and we'd wait till we were out of sight of the adults, and we'd start lighting them. And I mean, you had to carry a lighter with you. Of course, as we got older, there was no problem because we were smoking anyway, so we needed a lighter for our cigarettes. This is back maybe when we were 13 or 14, but when we were really young, and that's really where I'm talking about, probably 7, 8 years old. Uh, we'd actually get when we got up there, we'd get a rowboat with the cabin. And my father would always take his boat, and he had a sea nymph, which, I think he had a 25 horse on it. Of course, there were no electric motors, there were no depth finders or anything back in those days. So it was pretty much just a boat with 3 seats on it. But he had it laid out pretty good, and he did all his fishing out of that boat. And so when we'd go to Canada, he'd drag that boat up there, and him and my brother or him and my mother would mostly fish together. And me and my little brother, we'd get the free boat. But the free boat didn't have a motor. It had a set of oars. That was it. And so pretty much every day, again, back in those days, we didn't have the helmets and the elbow pads and the knee pads, and we didn't have mom and dad watching over us like hawks. But we'd go out, no life jackets, and we'd climb into this little rowboat, and we'd row out a couple 100 yards, and we'd drift fish. And I got to tell you, it was some of the best fishing of my life. If you can imagine, now these boats were pretty good size, but and a lot of times when we rowed them, we'd sit side by side, and we'd take one side, one oar, and the other, my brother would take the other oar. But once we got to where we wanted to be, it was maybe 20, 25 feet of water. And we'd let the wind kind of blow us across. It was kind of an open bay. And we just drift fish. We'd set up a rig on our spinning rods. We're using Mitchell 300 spinning reels back then, monofilament line. And we just rig it up with a weight on the bottom and a hook or two hooks coming off, snelled hooks coming off, and put a gob of night crawlers on there. And boy, I mean, we'd catch bluegills, we'd catch sunfish, we'd catch perch, walleye, catfish, and occasional bass. But you never knew what you were going to catch, and that's what we loved about it. But you'd be going along, and that old rod would just real quick you know, and you'd jerk up, and you'd have a nice fish. But we'd go out, we'd take a bucket with us, and we'd throw all the fish in the bucket. We'd come back in, we'd have a mess of fish, and we'd take them down to the fish house, and we'd clean them ourselves. We didn't wait for my parents to do it. Now, we weren't that good at cleaning them, but back then, we didn't flay the fish. We simply scaled them, cut their heads off, and gutted them. And they were good to go. And that's the way my mom cooked them, at least for a few years. Uh, but I can still remember being in the boat. And my brother Bill, I hate to say this about anybody, but he was a lazy son of a bitch. I mean, he could fall asleep in a minute. He never did anything that required him to exert himself too much. I never met anybody in my life that could relax as easily as he did. As a matter of fact, years later, and I talk about this in another video, but years later, when we had a bass fishing club, a chapter of bass that we started in the early 70s, I was probably maybe in my early 20s. Bill was a year and a half, 2 years younger than me, but he was in the club. And we all had CB radios back then. And we had the interchangeable brackets that you could put in your truck, and you could put another one in the boat. And so everybody would take it out of the truck when you got to the lake, and you'd put it in the boat. And then we could talk to each other throughout the day as we fished the tournament. And of course, we all had handles. Back then, my original handle was the Weed Wing Wizard. Uh, and I talk a lot about that in another video. It was one of my favorite lures. I fished it a lot and just kind of picked up that name somewhere along the way. Later, as we got more into CB radios and handles, eventually I changed it from the Weed Wing Wizard to Tackle Box. And that's probably still appropriate today because I have a lot of fishing tackle. But anyway, going back to my brother, my little brother, his nickname or his CB handle was Sleepy. like, like the Seven Dwarfs, he was Sleepy because he could always fall asleep at a moment's notice. Not to this day, I wonder sometimes if he had narcolepsy, but he uh, he just could relax, kind of slow his whole body down, his metabolism, and take a little nap. Well, we'd be laying there, and we were small, when whatever age we were, 7, 8, whatever it was, and we would stretch out on the metal seat or the wood seat going across. There were three of them in the boat. We'd stretch out. We'd put our feet up on the end, on the gunnel, and we'd actually rest the fishing rod between our toes. And, it was an easy way to kind of relax and just, hold the rod kind of at our side or on our chest. But the rod blank itself would be sitting right between our two toes. And then if you got a bite, you'd feel it right away. Well, I used to, when my brother'd fall asleep, I used to reach over with my rod and I'd grab his line and just twitch it a couple of times real fast. And boy, he would jump up out of there and he'd be setting the hook, and it was always good for a laugh. But the other thing we used to do, and this, I think back on it, this was not only stupid, but potentially dangerous. Um, and it wasn't so much back when we first started fishing together that it was a problem, but later when we started fishing in a boat where we actually had an outboard motor. And that happened a few years later when my dad bought an old outboard, and we would take it with us. And then the boat that Bill and I got, we put that little motor on the back of it. But of course, it had like a 5-gallon gas can that went with it, had to hook to it. But anyway, going back to the scenario where we were in this rowboat with no motor, we would be, laying on these seats, and again, Bill would fall asleep. I'd light a firecracker and I'd throw it up under his seat, scare the hell out of him, and then we'd have firecracker wars where we'd throw firecrackers back and forth at each other. Stupid, but like I say, we unfortunately we continued doing this all the way up to the time that we had an outboard motor in there with a gas tank. Never occurred to us that those sparks from a firecracker could blow up the gas can and kill us. But it's again a stupid thing that kids do. Speaking of which, one of my brother's hobbies, I guess, one of the things he loved to do was while we were fishing, every once in a while we'd catch these little perch, and they were maybe 5 or 6 inches long. And we didn't keep them because they weren't very big. But we always had seagulls that would follow us. And if we caught a fish, we'd throw them back and the seagulls would try to get them. They were still stunned, so they were on the surface. And if they weren't, maybe we'd throw them against the bottom of the boat and stun them so that when we threw them out, they would just be on the surface. The birds would come down and they'd pick them up. And the birds got pretty used to us. And so we'd always have a flock of 8 or 10 seagulls kind of flying around waiting for us to catch a small perch. So what Bill decided to do one day was to stuff a firecracker down the mouth of a perch and light it. And he would throw it as hard as he could, as far as he could up into the air in the hopes that a seagull would grab it while it was in the air and it would blow up in their face. Of course, wishful thinking, that never happened. Usually the perch ended up hitting the water. The water put the firecracker out. Bird came down, picked it up, and maybe it had a firecracker still in its mouth, maybe not. But we never did get to see a bird's head blowing up. But that was the game plan. That's what we tried to do. And it was pretty fun because, they would swoop right down. You'd swear they would pick it up while it was still in the air, but it just never happened, at least not with us, with the firecrackers. So anyway, we would come back in and we'd bring a bucket of fish in. Maybe it was 12 fish, maybe it was 25. But we'd bring them back in. We took them right down to the fish house where you actually clean the fish and you just threw the guts overboard. And, snapping turtles and anything else that happened to eat fish would usually eat them up. You never found any remains of fish the next day. There was always animals that would come around and eat them. But right next to the fish cleaning house was another large building, and we were told not to go in there. And so, of course, we went in there, and it was amazing. It was full of ice. Now, this is the middle of summer. This is July, hottest month of the year. And there's blocks of ice in there, huge blocks of ice. And they're covered with sawdust. Now, little did I know, at home, we had a refrigerator. I thought everybody had refrigerators. When we got to our little cabin up in Rice Lake, it didn't have a refrigerator. It had a wooden box, which was called an ice box. And about every other day, they would come by and bring us a block of ice, and you'd put the block of ice in the little box, and it would keep your things cold. It was a little messy because you're always getting water spills everywhere. But this is where they got the ice from. Apparently, in the wintertime, they'd go out, and the lake would freeze, and they'd go out, chainsaws, and just cut blocks of ice and bring it back, and they'd store it in this building, the ice building. And I guess to keep it from melting together, they would coat it with sawdust to keep it from melting into each other, becoming one big block of ice. Well, what was so unique about this place was the fact that they would catch snapping turtles, big snapping turtles. I don't know if you've ever seen a big snapping turtle. They got to be one of the ugliest creatures God's ever created. And they are ferocious. You do not want to have one grab your finger because he will take it home with him. They will snap a finger off. They'll snap a bone in your arm. They are so powerful, and they won't let go. We used to get them all the time and put them on. They'd bite a stick, and you carry them around on the stick. They'd never let go. It was amazing, the grip they had and the strength they had. Well, what we found in the ice house was a lot of the old timers would go out and they'd catch these big snapping turtles, and when they brought them in, they'd whack off their heads. And then they'd take them over to the ice house and just throw them in there. Apparently it took 7 or 8 days for them to die, so in the meantime, they'd be crawling around with no heads. And again, for a young boy, this was Disneyland. This was just incredible. we just couldn't believe it. We see all these big snapping turtles, and most of them are still, but occasionally you see one walking around, and there's still some dried blood, along the collar, and it was just really amazing. But we had some incredible experiences. And we had a lot of incredible experiences back home as well. But Rice Lake just was the icing on the cake. We look forward to that trip every year, and every year we'd go up for 2 weeks. And even my first couple of years that I got married, uh, I remember my wife and I went up, and we actually had a small camper, and we stayed in the camper. We didn't keep it very long because my wife's idea of camping out is called the Hilton. She's not one for roughing it. So, but anyway, we had some great times up there. One last little thing I'll tell you about our trip up there. One of the things we used to do, we used to catch a lot of frogs. And I don't know if you ever went frog fishing before. I don't even know if it's something people do. But we just one day got the idea, having seen all these frogs, that we could catch them on a fishing rod. And so we tried different little flies and little lures and hooks with worms on them and didn't have much success. And one day my dad told us, he said, you ought to try a little piece of red, little flannel of red material. And so my mother just happened to have some old rags there, and she cut us up some small pieces of red material. We put them on our hooks, and you had to weight it down a little bit. But we would go out on the dock, and there was one dock in particular that was surrounded by lily pads, and those frogs would come in pretty close. You didn't even have to cast; you could just kind of dangle it over the side. And I got to tell you, them frogs loved that red flannel, and we'd catch a ton of frogs. In fact, we caught some really big ones, and when we showed them to my dad and a couple of my uncles, they become dinner. They became dinner pretty quick. They became frog legs. And that was the first time I'd ever eaten frog legs. But these were some big bullfrogs. But a lot of the smaller frogs, especially later as we got a little older, we started fishing with them. And I'll tell you, if you ever fish with a frog, it's quite an experience. I mean, you throw it out there about 20 or 30 feet, and you see that frog, and he's just swimming towards shore. And then all of a sudden, he starts swimming real fast because there's a bass on his butt. Uh, that's a lot of fun too. But what I was leading up to is we'd catch a bunch of them, and I can't blame this on Bill because I was just as guilty. We used to do this from time to time. We'd put a bunch of them in a 5 gallon bucket. We'd stand back about 5 feet. We'd light up an M80, throw it in the bucket. I know it's pretty sadistic, but I'm telling you, there'd be nothing left but just frog guts all over the bucket. In some cases, it blew out the bucket, but just another stupid little prank that kids do. I can remember people would ask my mom, what's it like to have three boys and one girl? And she used to say, well, the girls are a lot easier to raise. And they'd say, well, what's the problem with boys? And she said, boys aren't even human until they get to be about 18 or 19. She said, when they're growing up, they're little monsters and they're into everything and they're very inquisitive and they don't listen. No matter how many times you warn them, no matter how many times you tell them not to do something, they're going to do it anyway. And that really kind of describes me and my little brother. So anyway, that's just a little brief glimpse back into my past. That's going way back. That's going back, almost 70 years. And for a lot of you, I'm sure you can go back even further. But sometimes it's good to take a few minutes and just think back. Um, My brother passed away a few years ago, and you know, you miss people when they're gone, but as long as you have that memory, you know, they're still around. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I got a lot more stories to tell you, especially about growing up, some of the crazy stuff we did. But if you have any comments, if you had similar experiences when you were growing up, put them in the column below. Put them in the comments because a lot of folks read those comments. I certainly read them, and I'll try to get back to you. Thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to talking with you again.